This is Amalgamations, the Contemporary Jewish Artists podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Klaus. For this episode, I'm very lucky to get to interview someone who I've gotten to know very well over many years. She's my sister, Lila Klaus. Lila is a dancer and a choreographer and a teacher. I'm wondering, what are some early dance and movement memories that have stuck with you, and how did those memories shape you?
As long as I can remember, I've always been moving and dancing, so it seems like some of my earliest memories are just the times when I was growing up and developing and being a human being. our our mother, my mother had a dance company, started right when I was born, Cross Currents Dance Company, and so soon as I was born, little baby, my mom would have me in the studio with rehearsals. I think those were definitely some of my most formative experiences, both as a dancer and also as a human being. I started dance when I was 5, little kinder dance, those classic, like, putting the little kid in the tiny little tutu in the tiara and doing, like, little ballet moves, and just completely in love and always wanting to be moving 24/7.
Tell me more, maybe as you got older, how, and I guess also why did you engage more deeply in dance? I mean, I know some of the work that you did as you got into high school, but maybe explain more about that and what that meant to you.
Yeah, I feel like it was one of those things where it just felt natural and it made sense. I mean, I was always dancing, I was always at the studio, I was always watching. I feel like there was never any decision of I wanna dive into it. It was just who I was as a person. It was just so fundamental. It's just, this is the thing that I'm doing.
Maybe you could dive a little deeper, just because I happen to know some of the work that you've done. Talk a little more specifically about your choreographic work as you were growing up, and how that developed, and how did you develop your identity as a, not just a dancer, but as a creator.
At 12 years old was when I made my first solo. It was to, I think, an Imogen Heap song. I think it was one of the, like, most emo, like, but also with this, like, long flowing dress. I mean, I watched our mother used to, run a high school dance company. She was a teacher at a private school, and she ran a dance company, so I'd watch her coach and develop and talk these middle and high schoolers through the choreographic process. So that was definitely a first exposure I had to choreography, was through her and how she was teaching. And so then I went to a creative and performing arts magnet school where I started my choreographic process there. I mean, I made a lot of solos. I would make a lot of solos for myself, middle school, going into high school, a couple of duets as well, just really starting to get my feet wet for sure. I was really lucky to be in a really great dance training environment that gave us these choreographic skills in this toolbox that I think most people don't get until they at least get to college. My senior year of high school, I made my first group piece. It was actually in collaboration with a music student, John Tafone, who he was an undergraduate student at Catholic University. And that was a really cool opportunity where I had 4 dancers, I believe, 4 dancers, and he wrote an original score for me, and that was my first time choreographing more than one body on the stage as well. And that's when I knew, like, that was the thing I wanna keep doing, is just making group work. I'd say that my training experience in high school was definitely more formal. I was taught, older techniques and kind of more of a classics base, if you will.
Do you mean like ballet and that type of thing, or?
Yeah, I'd say ballet, techniques from an older generation. I think once I got to college, I went to Bard for dance. My teacher, Lively Moan, in her technique, I also studied the technique of Lester Horton, which is the same technique that the Alvin Ailey Dance Company uses. I had a teacher I taught study with her for most of high school as well. So we think about older techniques versus more contemporary techniques. Older techniques tend to be more codified. They have um, steps and structures and a system that usually within the history of modern dance started around between the early 50s to early 60s, kind of in that time period. And a little bit before as well, that's when really an older quote unquote modern dance technique started to emerge. So that was more of my background.
So it's interesting because you talk all about these technical aspects of your training and the structural aspects of choreography that you thought about. At what point in your life do you feel like in your work, in your creative work, the emotional or narrative aspect of your creations came into play, or was it there from the beginning?
That has actually really been in flux for me, which is interesting. It has not been a very clear trajectory of my work has gotten more of this sort of emotional, kind of very spiritual, almost narrative, I would say. I think in high school, a lot of that did come, and I think a lot of my intense passion was more from a life experience standpoint, I would say. I like to kind of joke that I was making dances that were sort of like my teenage diary put out onto stage. Yeah, and then once I got to college, when I got to Bard, that's really critical point in your life where you're really starting to question who you are. So it is much more intellectual, much more heavy in the mind. So I think that I was always trying to find myself because with my Jewish identity and my spirituality and that, which is always so, which I think has been ingrained in me for a very long time. Sometimes I found myself at odds a little bit in an academic institution where work that one might see as more emotional and maybe a little bit more intense wasn't always in fashion.
Well, I want to definitely get into that a whole lot. I think you opened up the doors to a huge discussion. Oh, and by the way, for all my listeners, I did see almost all of her high school dances, and they were quite wonderful, just to be fair. Anyway, before we jump into sort of how these two parallel elements of your identity or two parallel identities came together, let's talk a little bit more about your Jewish background. So, of course, I know that you were active in your synagogue growing up and still are to an extent. And I know that you're working in the Jewish community these days. I know that you went to Jewish summer camp for a little bit. You were involved in your youth group. Tell me more about how all of those experiences shaped you, sort of however you would want to paint that trajectory.
Our house was always a Jewish home. We were surrounded by books and knowledge and really deep discussions. Was involved in youth group and I was involved in a lot of Jewish activities, summer camp, like you said. But I think that our Jewish home, our upbringing, the conversations that we would have with our parents, I think that is really what shaped me as a Jewish individual. Definitely, those other things are very much what shaped me as well. But the fact that we would have deep discussions about, like, what is God? Why do we do this in Judaism? I never got to meet my grandfather, but our grandfather was also a rabbi. So I think that those really deep questions about Judaism, about faith and religion, I think that it's something that's ingrained in our DNA, particularly our nuclear family. We've had the open space to question and to discover and to dive deep. And that definitely shaped my artistic identity as well.
Interesting. So for you, it wasn't so much the communal aspect of it, but the intellectual, the discussions, and the deep thoughts that Judaism for you growing up always you were surrounded by. Does that sound accurate?
Definitely, yes, for sure. I was just thinking about this memory of one time we were in Rosh Hashanah services, and it was that point in the service where I was starting to get a little bit tired. And then I just remember looking up at the ceiling and starting to study the little designs in the ceiling. I think it was elementary school. For me, that was one of the first moments I realized that it's not necessarily the big things in Judaism or the Jewish fanfare itself or the fanfare of religion as a whole, but it's the little moments in between. For me, the culture, the context, the religion, the writing is a gateway into asking deeper, pointed questions about the world as a whole.
Interesting. I never knew that story, so thanks for sharing. By the way, our grandfather did meet you, but you were very very young. Anyway, so let's talk about how the dancer slash choreographer side of you and this Jewish side of you came together. So as you became more serious about dance, and by the time you got to high school, you were dancing every day, as I remember. Were there ever times when it felt like this dancer identity was in conflict with your Judaism or your Jewish identity?
I think there's a sort of a twofold. I think on a more surface level sense, there are times when just simply my dancing, my schedule with that conflicted with my Jewish schedule. I was in a conservatory training program. I had to stop doing that program for a whole year as I studied for my bat mitzvah. So that's a very serviceable example of like how the physically was in conflict with one another. I had to make a lot of choices. I don't know if I call them sacrifices, but just choices that I made as I got older. In high school, I focused more in the dance and less in the Judaism. It's just simply that I made a decision that that was what I wanted to dive more deep into at the time. So I think in that sense, it conflicted. And I think also at a kind of a little bit of a deeper level, I think that I've always been very clear in this identity of my Judaism and my dance intersecting, and I think did not encounter many individuals who necessarily thought the same. So I think I maybe saw myself as a little bit more of an oddball out, a little bit more of a straying away from the pack.
Yeah, I definitely identify with that. I talked in the last episode about being that weird kid who would go to Jewish camp and practice trumpet in his free time. Then at what point did you realize that you could start to bridge that gap where, I've observed you bringing elements of Judaism into your work.
I think that I really start to think about it my first year at Bard, actually. I think I had elements of it in high school. I don't know if I necessarily truly made that connection really, but I think it sort of maybe came out in bits and pieces. I remember one of the solos that I made, I was for a teacher of mine who had passed away, and probably without me even realizing it, I think I was approaching that spirituality and that thinking about life and death through a Jewish lens because it just comes so naturally. But I think for sure once I got to Bard, when I started reading more text, when I started to find the connection of, oh, you can find dance and dance theory and history and all of that in these texts that I'm reading. So really, yeah, my first year of college for sure.
I want to get into that, but I'm curious, how did the work of Liz Lerman influence you prior to college?
Liz Lerman is a dancer, choreographer, wonderful human being. She
And
um,
a family friend, might I add.
and a family friend. She founded the Dance Exchange in Washington, D.C., a wonderful organization. She's done wonderful work all around D.C., the country, the world, focusing on bridging the gap of dance and performance and communal spaces. She has made dance for synagogues, she's made dances at museums, she's made dances in Navy shipyards. She was also very close friends with the rabbi of the synagogue that we attended. And so every year, ever since I could remember, she would do this project called the Elul Project, leading up to the month of Elul and a very sacred time. The synagogue would send out these texts and these readings for then congregants to respond to. Liz would then take a couple of volunteers and they would take bits and pieces of these texts for the afternoon services of Yom Kippur. Basically, instead of one of the afternoon services, we would do a movement service, which since this was something I grew up with, I didn't necessarily realize that this was unique to Micah. I just assumed that everybody did this.
I mean, everyone doesn't dance in temple?
I didn't even realize how important and how integral that was to my experience of merging my Judaism and my dance until when I got to be much older. So I think that was always a part of me. So that's kind of the backstory. But the story I was thinking about was at Micah, we were having an auction, a fundraiser one night, and then I was walking around with Dad, and then I saw that there was this book, Liz's book, Hiking the Horizontal. And I saw it, I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. And then Dad, he like furiously kept bidding and bidding to make sure that he could win it for me. And it was a signed copy. So that was freshman, sophomore year of high school. And so then I won it and I picked up, read it that night, and I started flipping through, and my world completely changed. I think that is actually the first sign of the merging of Judaism and dance, I would say. I think actually that I would pretty much pinpoint.
Tell me more.
So I started reading, and I hadn't even realized the impact that Liz had had on dance, and reading about her stories of Judaism and her religion and how she took that into synagogues and spaces, and this idea of this Jewish value of community and a communal space, and how we can look at sacred space and the process of moving the body and how we can apply that to so many different places that we dwell. That was something that completely blew my mind. And her thoughts about Judaism and the world, and how she also really a lot talks in that book about how she bridges those two narratives. I thumbed through that whole thing. I've read Hiking the Horizontal more times than I can count.
It's interesting that you say all that because I've been in so many of those movement services, and like you, I've watched dance my whole life, and it's always fascinating for me to see a movement service through the eyes of people who haven't, for whom this is just this novel, incredible experience. That we can embody spirituality physically. But anyway, you talked about sacred spaces, and that's a great segue into talking about some of the work that you've done over the last few years. Now, your work is rooted in Martin Buber's concept of I-thou relationships. Could you just explain to our listeners, what is that?
Martin Buber, a Jewish philosopher, rabbi, he wrote this text called I and Thou. So essentially, his theory of the I Thou is that there's three relationships in the world. There's the I you, the I it, and the I and Thou. So the I you and the I it, these relationships could be between two people, object to object, person to object. But with the I you, the I it relationship, one person only sees another person, other object as simply the shape of who they are. The person is just simply a person who's existing, or the object it's really just about the shape and the form, the line, but there isn't an equal relationship. So oftentimes you might have power over a person or an object, but then when one consciously decides to enter into an I thou relationship, that is a relationship where two people, or a person object, share equal responsibility. Especially with two people, one does not hold power over the other. The two people really see each other as equals.
And that can again be between person to person, person to object, or does it have to be between people?
It can be person to person, person to object, and for Buber, this idea with the I thou relationship, that I thou relationship mimics the relationship that we have with God.
So then, as I understand it, you picked up his seminal work called "I and Thou" at a bookstore the summer before your senior year of your undergrad at Bard. Can you paint a picture of that experience? What was that like?
That summer before my senior year at Bard, I had attended the American Dance Festival. One of the teachers who was also ended up being my advisor, Leah Cox, very much my mentor as well. One of the classes that she was teaching at ADF, she had actually talked about Buber and I thou, and she kind of used it as a springing off point for this class that she was teaching. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Kind of put it in the back burner of my mind. I feel like I could see, because I was starting to think about, because that was a summer where I had to start this year-long process at Bard called the senior project. For the dance students, you make between 1 and 2 dances. So I was starting to kind of put that in the back burner of my mind of, what am I going to do for my senior project? And then August, so it was 1 month or so after American Dance Festival was over, I was perusing Politics and Prose in DC, and I was looking through, as I always do, the religion and the Judaism section, and then out of the corner of my eye, I see a copy of I and Thou. And I was like, oh, I think that's what Leah was talking about. I picked it up, I thumbed through the first page, I started reading, and instantly, sort of like when I found Hiking the Horizontal for the first time, is one of those moments where it feels like light bulb just almost went off my head. I bought it back home, and I just sat in my backyard and just read it for hours and hours and hours, and immediately highlighting, marking, trying to find all of the connections to dance and my thoughts, and just it felt like a springboard into this entire process.
So you write in your thesis that you've always been interested in forming authentic I-thou relationships. Why is that?
I think that was a value that's always been instilled in us. It could boil down to just treating others with respect and really valuing those that you're with. I think that that's a value that has always been ingrained in us, for sure.
Well, that's the first of three value systems that you have put out in your writing. These three value systems that guide your work. The first, authentic relationships. The second, vulnerability, and the third is lineage. So let's dive a little deeper into authentic relationships. Lila's interest in I-thou relationships led to a work that she premiered in the fall of 2017 called Everything is Inevitable. Can we view any of your work online?
Yes, you can go to my website, lilaruthklaus.weebly.com. That is LilaRuthklaus Klaus.weebly, weebly.com.
And I would encourage any of our listeners to view some of her dances as you listen or before you listen to get more of a context of what we're talking about. I was lucky to be present for that premiere and to witness the beautiful landscape of relationship between the two performers emerge on top of a space that was lit almost like a cathedral. And let me just say, I think, Lila, that it is ingenious how you took Buber's idea that I-thou relationships mimic people's relationship with God and use that as an impetus for the creative process with Gemma Allen, your co-creator. Could you talk about some of the challenges you faced early on in the creative process and how those challenges helped you to realize what the piece should really be about?
Prior to this piece, we hadn't really interacted much, I would say. So I really went into that process almost truly blind. So, where do you start with someone really truly from scratch? So we had to almost in a way, this is kind of like dating where you have to get to know each other first and then like get into the meat and the thick of things. So it was a lot to ask someone. I'm like, I don't really know you much, but let's just dump into this really deep artistic process together.
Was that a blessing in disguise almost?
For sure, I think it really served as almost a laboratory of how to actually build the I thou relationship in the studio. We had a few challenges of like at the end of the day, it was my senior project. So there was still a little bit of that power difference, but I was still trying to figure out how can the two of us really be equals together in the room right now.
How is that process different from dances you've choreographed in the past?
I was thinking about a painter painting a canvas of what is it that I want to convey across, but with this piece, I was both in the thick of things, experiencing the movement process. I mean, moving your body is in itself such a spiritual experience alone. So I had to both be in it and also be out of it at the same time, looking with my choreographic eye of, okay, what is it that I want to start shaping?
So, is it accurate then to say that everything is inevitable is maybe not so much a portrayal of I thou relationships, but a portrayal of what might come when an I thou relationship is developed?
Yeah, I think for sure. I think that that piece was not necessarily this is what I thou relationship looks like, but we went through the process of discovering it. So here's sort of a snapshot of what it looks like right now. Buber talks about how with the I thou relationship, there sort of starts to be this third being, this third entity, third sense of that spirituality that emerges. And Leah had talked about without even knowing that context, she felt like there was almost a third thing or a third being in the room when she was watching it. So I feel as though that piece was sort of how do we get to that third thing of that sort of greater, elevated something that's bigger than yourself?
Watching it, I didn't necessarily get a narrative in the story sense from the piece, but I really got a narrative of relationship, whatever that may mean. And it was just fascinating to see how this third being, so to speak, came out. So, connecting this process, which was rooted in Buber, to your personal experience, you write that this work uncovered your desire for authenticity, which is something that you seek in your own religious practice. So I'm wondering, how did the process of creating Everything is Inevitable affect your religious practice moving forward?
It really highlighted for me that the Jewish communities and the Jewish rituals and practice that I was most interested in seeking out and being a part of were ones that they're really about getting it to the root of why is it that we're doing this? How can we have these practices in a way that make us feel connected to the earth and to God and to our past? So I think I continued to seek out really good, authentic Jewish communities.
Sure. So let's move to talking about your second value, vulnerability. You write about an experiment that you did at a dance workshop at Bard in early 2018. So it would have been soon after the premiere of Everything is Inevitable. Can you explain this experiment for us? And can you read out the directions that you gave?
We had this assignment where we had to do a presentation of what we had done. So I had everybody in the space sitting in a circle around the dance studio, and led them to this guided meditation. And I had them all turn to face one another. So you had one person that you're working with, and I gave them the directions of The only thing you need to do is look at this person and listen to the words that I'm giving you. So I gave them this prompt. Turn to the person next to you or someone nearby. All I ask for you is to just simply look at the person, no talking. Take a moment to witness this person, to really see this person, and not just passively glance at them, where they are now in this very moment. It might feel scary to be seen in this way, but I encourage you to ease into this experience of being seen. Instead of trying to remove yourself or put up a barrier, this person is just like you. They have their own dreams and fears and curiosities and excitement. They are fascinated and terrified by the weight of the world. They may be a stranger, but we are all strangers to each other once. You both share an equal amount of responsibility in this brief relationship. This pairing can only exist with the both of you in this brief moment of time.
What did you learn from that?
It was interesting. There was this divide that happened of whether they felt excited with someone giving them a moment to be real. And there's kind of the other divide of people felt as though they're almost being forced to into authenticity or forced into whatever they felt that it was at the moment. Some people really embrace vulnerability, and for other people, they feel as though it can be thrust upon them too quickly.
Interesting. Well, as you describe the conversation that this exercise sparked led you to realize the connection of vulnerability and authenticity to the act of being on stage and offering what you call ritual display. I'm wondering, what do you mean by ritual display? And I'm certainly very interested in hearing you dive a little bit into that word ritual. Right? We all understand performance as display. What is ritual display?
Performer goes onto stage, shares something audience is seeing. The fact that that happens over and again in performance, for me, that is ritual. I mean, there's so many rituals that are also embedded within the process and preparation of performing as well. The backstage, the getting ready, the going on. So the fact that performance is cyclical and then the act of sharing something as well, I find to be ritualistic.
Sure. So let's move then to talking about your third value, which is that of lineage. Now, you talk about the lineage of modern dance giants Ted Shawn and Martha Graham, specifically alluding to their and certainly others' dances that presented biblical themes and images. And yet, your work is fueled by religious inquiry, not religious portrayal. Do you think that these dance giants from the first half of the 20th century influence you religiously?
I think that goes back to that question that you had earlier of what is it that you're seeking in Jewish spaces. I think that retelling is important, but then I'm more interested not necessarily in the retelling or the restaging or the showing something that we already know, but using that practice, those ideas, those values to then create something new, something that goes deeper, I would say. So I think that I find myself aligning with those in my own Judaism, but I also think that a little bit at odds as well.
Can you explain now for our listeners how and why thinking and dance transitioned from modernism to postmodernism? And it seems like you think that we're, I don't know, maybe stuck in modernism. Am I understanding that correctly?
Dance World is actually much more caught in this postmodernist aesthetic of there's all of these different narratives and I think more of an abstraction of the modernist ideals, which typically tended to portray things and send representational versus postmodern, which abstracted these representations and then dove into something deeper. So I think the dance world is much more in that postmodernist of these universal human narratives of life, death, God, not necessarily always there. And I find myself kind of stuck in the middle of those two.
Oh, so would that make you a postmodernist?
I'm middle modernist. I don't know what the terminology.
Somewhere in between modernism and postmodernism.
Yeah.
I want to sort of pin down where you are because, I'm fascinated by this idea of favoring the intersection of our identities over a universal human narrative.
Hmm.
It seems like you ascribe to that idea.
It's interesting reflecting on this now, a couple years later, kind of coming out of that, where I stand, because I've now been a few years away from the more liberal arts abstract thinking, which with that education, that mindset, it typically tends to abstract, abstract, abstract. How can we sort of get away from this? But I think that is very much part of who I am as well. I mean, I I myself am a conglomeration of so many intersectional identities. I mean, in my Jewish self, my dancer self, my queer self, there is no one universal human narrative, but also at the same time, I am still interested in this modernist almost ideal of how are we collectively as a society progressing? What is the universal human experience?
Mm.
I feel as though sometimes dance is not necessarily interested in the universal human experience, but more the personal experience, the meta narrative. Where is my path in life? What is my trajectory? Which I think for sure has its place. But for me, I question where does that draw the line of more, a little bit maybe more self ish versus selfless.
Mm. It almost sounds as though you're saying that we've moved past a delineation of modern versus postmodern. And so, maybe it is a postmodern, it's a post everything world, right? So these three values, authenticity, vulnerability, and lineage, came together in a piece that you premiered in the spring of 2018, which was called And So We Hold On to This Moment. Could you explain how each value played out in the creative process and ultimately the final product, and how the process was different than Everything is Inevitable?
For that piece, that was a trio that I choreographed. I was not a part of that trio. I would say in terms so that's in terms of process. I went back to that more outside choreographic eye, the painter's eye. I took everything that I learned from the duet of being in the midst of the creative process, being a dancer in it, and this choreographic sense of being, this way that I made dance, kind of actually more almost shadowing high school in a way of narrative and emotion and trying to get back to something that was more of my roots, and so I was interested in how to sort of merge the 2. There was bits and sections that I worked on with dancers in different days. I think I started with this duet that I was working on, kind of shaping a duet that paints a more detailed picture of the authentic relationship, but I think there's moments where I was also working on trio material as well. So I think that that piece strived to be a coming together of all of the selves of me.
And when I saw it, I definitely saw more of a narrative structure to it. Just a very different work. And Everything is Inevitable is so clearly rooted in this idea of I thou relationships, Buber, and this seeking of a deeper understanding of our, as Jewish people and as humans, our relationship with each other and God. In that light, and so we hold on to this moment, a Jewish work.
I don't think it's necessarily a Jewish work per se. It is more of a reflection of my self and a reflection of journey, where Judaism is very important in the journey and in the process.
I love that answer. Thank you. So you're working as a congregational educator now and still making dances. How has the process of creating these two pieces that we talked about influenced your current work?
I think that we can look at my educational work and my choreographic work, sort of two sectors that I'm sort of holding on to right now. For my educational work, I think that the idea of authentic relationships is very much present in the classroom. I work primarily with kindergarten through second grade. We teach them how do we start to form Jewish relationships? What does it mean to bond with one another? On our curriculum, it's all about like, what is God? Who are we? Why are we here? When I saw the curriculum, I'm like, oh, that's everything that I've been working on.
What about in your dance that you're making these days?
With my concert work, now that I've had this practice of looking at authentic relationships in this Jewish lens, I think that I'm able to jump a little bit more into the process because I'm still continuing to develop this. This is not something that's stagnant. I'm still interested in how to put these Jewish influences in, but now immediately my lens is always Jewish instead of trying to develop that Jewish lens in the context of studio and rehearsal and process. I think now that it's an eye that I've almost trained of now that that's how I'm always looking at my work.
So you're Jewish, you're a dancer, you've searched for ways to bring these pieces together. There are so many other things about you. Who are you?
Good question. I am a early career artist and educator that values spirituality and diving into a deeper sense of self that can be taken into a multitude of environments.
Hmm. Thanks. Now, what would you want the listener to take away from our conversation?
To think about what it is that they value when looking at art and using what they value and looking at what is important to them as a lens for viewing the work of others. And from there, what is it that you see as an audience member that the artist is trying to convey in their own value system?
Thank you. What's next?
Continuing to create more work. I'm currently based in the Boston area, slowly but surely figuring out what it means to be an independent artist. Hopefully, have my first full length show or be part of a dance company, part of full length work, just continuing to create my own work and put myself into the Boston dance scene. I'm currently working with the synagogue in the greater Boston area. I've been developing curriculum with them for the past almost 2 years now, creating workshops around movement and Judaism and investigating prayer through movement. So, continuing to develop that into more of a brand. I'd love to take that into other synagogues to travel that, continuing to develop the educator Lila and the dance maker Lila.
Ain't that the truth, bringing all these things together? So, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I know you pretty well, but it's so fascinating to get to sit down with you and learn more about you on deeper levels and sort of, hear where your process is at, where your thinking is at. And I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening. Our theme song is F Minor Klezmer by the Underscore Orchestra from their album Fancy Cocktails and Hot Sauce. Check them out at theunderscoreorchestra.com. That's orchestra with a K, Orkestra. I'm your host, Aaron Klaus, and this has been Amalgamations, the Contemporary Jewish Artists Podcast.